choosing to share your afternoon with me in this community. I want to foremost honor my brown and Black brothers and sisters whose bodies, spirits have been broken from racial violence, racially charged language, and systemic racial discrimination and oppression. The blatant disregard for Black and brown bodies and racialized acts is evident in a cursory review of history. And if we are ever to heal as a nation, we must confront uncomfortable conversations openly like we're doing today. So it's for this reason that I'm grateful to Valerie and the other committee members who pushed to bring this unique speaking series to our OLLU community and the extended San Antonio community. So I want to take full advantage of this time and provide as much information as possible. But I'm also going to include a series of very short reflection opportunities throughout our time together, probably by 30, 60 seconds. So I encourage the audience to go find a pen and a paper to use this time to participate, or if you feel more compelled, to type your reflection into the chat message so others can see. And for those of you who are interested, we're going to have a much more intimate and interactive curriculum redesign session the following week. So a little bit about me. I know that many of you have worked with me. You may be somewhat familiar with my scholarship that Val introduced, but I'd like to share something else that a lot of people may not know entirely about me. So I live by the mantra that we're called, as Matthew Kelly says, to be the best version of ourselves. I consider teaching as an act of ministry and humility that calls us to a continual re-examination of our scholarship and our commitment to truly serve our students' bodies, our students' minds, and our students' spirits. By not addressing students' experiences with social injustice or inequalities, be it racial inequalities, health, food insecurity, disability, housing, gender, economic, sexual, or social class, I believe we're failing to address how these experiences impact their vocational discernment, their spirit, and their ability to learn. So for any of the educators in attendance today, as we go through this whole presentation, I'd like for you to kind of think about that. Are you being the best version of yourself in the classroom? So Valerie already sort of shared my intent. So I won't go over this entirely, but I posted it in case you missed what Val was saying. For all of us here today, we know that the topic of anti-racism or anti-racist pedagogy is not discussed in the academy. So clearly it cannot be done in 1 hour. It's going to really require the audience to do their own work in their individual pursuit to really understand this conversation. Some disclaimers. So our discussion in less than an hour is going to center on topics dealing clearly with language, race, and racism. So I just want to let all the audience members know, I understand that this content will surely provoke some deeply rooted emotions that a lot of us are going to find traumatizing, or maybe it's painful to hear, or it's hurtful to hear. Maybe some might find today's conversation offensive or just emotional. This particular topic asks all of us to draw on your own experiences with language, but more importantly, your action or your inaction regarding inequalities and injustices. So I really request that the audience take time to listen and really reflect on what brought you here this afternoon, which I believe is providence. Other things to know: anti-racism pedagogy can ground any course, any discipline in the academy, doesn't matter. And many of those in attendance already really adopt anti-racist pedagogies in the classroom, but you might not know that's what it's called. All the topics today will not be debated. This work is meant to be uncomfortable. Anti-racist theories calls all of us to be vulnerable. So when thinking about how I was going to set up today's topic, because there's so much information to send to you in such a short amount of time, I figured this was sort of the best way to go with it. First and foremost, I need to set the tone of what I want you to walk away with today. So I'll introduce that in a second. So as a rhetorician, I study language, and I thought fundamentally I wanted you to really understand the term racism. So we'll spend a considerable amount of time talking about what is racism, and then we'll move towards what it means to move towards anti-racism as a theoretical framework. And then I'll make and share with you why this pedagogical framework is so critical And then I'll give you lots of resources. Today's PowerPoint, I'm happy to share with you. It has lots of clickable links and lots of information that many of you may want to take with you. So let me set the tone with you, okay? I want to introduce Coyolxauhqui, moon goddess in Aztec mythology, daughter of Coatlicue. A shortened version of the story is that she encouraged her 400 brothers to kill their mother, who was then pregnant with Huitzilopochtli, who learned of her plot. So he sprang from his mother's room, armed to protect his mother, and he decapitated and dismembered his sister, throwing her body down the temple. So if you look at the back of the screen, that's an actual stone that commemorates the story, and it was actually found at the stairs of the Templo Mayor and dates back to circa 1473 CE. So Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa reimagines this narrative, arguing that Coyolxauhqui exemplifies women as conquered bodies and also symbolically represents her desire for epistemological and ontological decolonization. She develops a complex theoretical heuristic for healing, coined the Coyolxauhqui imperative, that is, quote, both the process of emotional, physical dismemberment, so it's the splitting of the body, mind, spirit, and soul, and the creative work of putting all those pieces back together again in a new form. It is the act of deconstructing and constructing oneself. So for today, I want to frame our entire discussion in this light, that you are here, even in the smallest way, to heal, or to bring healing to our community that feels broken, with bodies and spirits dismembered. Or you're here to participate in the creative process of learning how to put the pieces of ourselves back together again in some new, creative, healing, and empowering way. Like Coyolxauhqui, people oppressed by their color, their gender, their sexuality, or class are broken by a country plagued and shadowed by racist ideologies or practices. So how do we all learn to heal? I want to now extend Anzaldúa's conversation of wounded bodies whose spirits are dismembered and connect briefly to our Catholic identity as a university. So my cousin, Monica Gatlin, recently published an article in the South Texas Catholic, which that link will be there for those that are interested in reading it, where she reflected on our U.S. racial divisions after the murder of George Floyd. In the article, she questions her response to these events as both a mother and a Catholic, and she wonders if she had become desensitized to what she describes as, quote, the real pain that racism creates, end quote. She introduces this quote by Pope Francis that helped her examine her own consciousness and our nation's complicity, apathy, and silence on issues of injustice or inequalities. I was so intrigued by her story of Pope Francis, which made me want to go and find the entire article. So here's the article. In January 2015, Pope Francis visited the Philippines and was approached by a weeping 12-year-old girl who asked him why God let bad things happen. The Pope responded that only when we're able to weep about the things that you lived can we understand something and answer something. Francis added that it was only when Christ wept and was able to weep that he understood our dramas. Today's world needs to weep. The marginalized weep, those left aside weep, the scorned weep. But those of us who lead a life more or less without needs, we don't know how to weep. My cousin states at the end of her article, our nation is weeping. There is someone out there who needs me, who needs all of us to get out from underneath whatever is holding us back from listening, from opening our eyes, acknowledging human dignity, and loving the stranger, the neighbor, and the most vulnerable. So again, I ask the audience members, have we forgotten how to weep? So your first reflection for today, I'm going to time about 60 seconds so we can have lots of time for Q&A, is what can educators learn from this story, or what and who do you weep for? So I'll go ahead and time you now. Okay, moving on. Getting into the heart of what it means to understand anti-racist theory or anti-racist pedagogy is clearly to understand basically what is racism. So I want to introduce to you Candace Owens, who's considered to be the new face of conservatism. She's an American conservative author and a political commentator and a Republican activist. At a conservative political action conference in Harbor, Maryland, Owens stated the following in her speech, quote, "Truth number one, America is not a racist country. Stop selling us our own oppression. Stop taking away our self-confidence by telling us that we can't because of racism, because of slavery. I've never been a slave in this country." Candace Owens' bold comments are important to critically analyze, as she's not alone in her thoughts on what defines race or racism. So those who align with Owens' position might argue that this nation is not racist, as evident in our most recent history, the election of our 44th president, Barack Obama. See, how can we be a racist nation? We have a Black president. For Owens and those who align with her position, when people continue to perpetuate the message that America is not a racist country, she argues they further perpetuate and fuel racial divisions and hate. But for many people of color, their experiences with racism, racial inequalities, or racial assault is quite real and have always existed in institutional paradigms. Initially, I propose that Owens' complicity to ignore, deny, or minimize the injustices and inequalities experienced by people of color are disillusioned and an act of denial. However, my scholarly identity wants to truly understand, how can she be this blind when there is glaring evidence to suggest otherwise? Racial disparities exist in nearly every facet of our U.S. culture, including employment, wealth, education, home ownership, healthcare, and incarceration. I wonder, after reading Pope Francis's message, has Owens forgot how to weep for those who experience racial inequalities or injustices? So as a Chicana rhetorician, I study how language is used strategically in written, oral, and visual texts. I understand that language is always in a state of flux. So perhaps this is where the problem lies. We have a completely different understanding of what defines racism. So I begin here. What is racism? From studying Owens' position on the issue of racism, it's clear she understands racism as only a historical moment in our U.S. nation where groups of people were excluded, as illustrated in the sign, or embedded in the language of our U.S. Constitution and or laws of the land. Examples like Jim Crow, sundown laws, segregation laws, alien land laws, poll taxes, et cetera, et cetera. By framing racism only through the lens of our U.S. historical memory, we often are misguided in our judgment of only what we see by means of symbols of our historical intolerance, segregation, and hate. So because we don't see signage of segregation anymore, like this image here, some believe we clearly have eradicated racial disparities. This surface level approach to viewing racism only pacifies a white audience and their understanding of our U.S. racialized identity. So an alternative way to see this image is to signify the present. And when I do, I'm translating the guise of our past and our historical memory in a new spatial reality. So that's what in my field is called third space. My grad students who are watching this will understand this. In this third space, this image here is not fixed in a period of time, but real and imagined, and relocates this practice or policy of othering or marginalization into postmodern realities for people of color. In other words, how does this kind of othering seen here in this image continue symbolically in 2020 within social institutions? So this is your second reflection. I'll give you another 35 to 60 seconds. Okay. So perhaps now we need to dig just a bit deeper when studying the term racism. And instead think about the question, well, what does a racist look like? If tapping in only to historical memory, this image of the KKK might come to mind and represent a really shameful moment in our US historical landscape. But this image has only been modernized. And if you look at the next example from an event prior to the riots in Charlottesville, what is the glaring difference with these images? Or perhaps the answer to this question is to think maybe about a person who symbolized racist thought. So when trying to answer the question of who symbolizes the most, we may think about Adolf Hitler or George Wallace, or maybe even a modern day version of Richard Spencer. But to ground this discussion a bit more, we must target our own assumptions about racist or racism before moving forward. So we make lots of assumptions about racism or racist. And, you know, some of those may be that racists are they're all uneducated, which is clearly not the case, right? Racism leads to violent and extreme acts. And the story I'm going to share after this, sometimes these microaggressions aren't necessarily extreme, but ultimately still traumatize the person who's experiencing them. All racists are powerful. Racists are only white. BIPOC groups can't be racist. Racism is only exclusive to one political party. Racists are only from the South. Or racist is a fixed image. I really like this cartoon, and for those that can't see it, right, I'll kind of go through it if the font's difficult to read. There's not a racist bone in my body. Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't even see color. Really? Yes, I don't know why that's so hard for your people to believe. So let's be clear about racism and its meaning. Define racist or racism, or your understanding of it, your third reflection. Okay. So how do I define racism? Some may wonder. I find the 2018 United States Conference of Catholic Bishops a good place to start, and I do support their definition of racism, particularly what's highlighted here in yellow. When this conviction or attitude leads individuals or groups to exclude, ridicule, mistreat, or unjustly discriminate against persons on the basis of their race or ethnicity, it's sinful. So as a woman guided by faith and a higher power, I find this definition meaningful. Sure, I'd love it if the entire world would easily accept the notion that racism is a sinful act. But I must consider that this discourse might be too convoluted for a general public, which leads me to a more direct and simplified way to define race or racist. I've lately really adopted Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who's a New York Times bestseller, author, public speaker, and director for the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. He defines racism in his text, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he really simplifies it, which I'll kind of go through the screen. So for him, racism is clearly racist policies that ultimately lead to racial inequality and substantiated by racist ideals. For Kendi, racist is anyone who blames a racial group or believes social problems rest with a racial group, but fails then to recognize racist power or policy. So for him, it's the active or inactive action. It's not who a person is, it's just a descriptive term. Anti-racist is anyone who's trying to figure out what's wrong with racist policy and those with power to shape policy. So it recognizes the quality of difference and that ultimately we're all equal. It's this active action towards dismantling racist policy. For Kendi, his ultimate goal is to eradicate the phrase, I'm not racist, or I'm race neutral from our vocabulary. So it's pretty much forces these categories of racist or anti-racist. So building off Kennedy's position that racist policies ultimately lead to racist ideas, it's important that I contextualize this idea with some specific examples. So again, in Kennedy's book, he sets up this idea that people have instituted racist policies ultimately for their own self-gain, and that these racist ideas are ultimately produced to justify these ideas. And then the ideas are manufactured with strategic and intentional language. So the rhetorician in me is like, I get this. Language is manufactured with strategic and intentional language. So again, speaking only as a rhetorician, let me give you some examples of this. So if you look at manufactured language that's happened in political discourse recently, okay, Build the Wall was a manufactured strategic logo and phrase, okay? But then it created this. Why? So a group of elementary school teachers in Idaho dressed as the MAGA border wall for Halloween. And that's ultimately what Kennedy's trying to say, that they ultimately adopted this policy and then their action was to move forward in creating a whole Halloween costume, which clearly they put a lot of effort in that without thinking ultimately of who their audience was, which was clearly elementary kids. And in this particular school, they did have a relatively high demographic of students of color. But there's other manufactured language that's happened in political discourse. And I won't go through all of these. But again, think about the terminology of invasion, that there's an invasion of people coming, or maybe labeling certain groups of people as animal rapists, illegal alien, freeloader, right? This push for what is American versus anti-American. But I don't want to stop there with just manufactured language in political discourse. There's also manufactured language in education. So think about phrases and terms and concepts and ideologies like Bloom's taxonomy, no child left behind, standardized tests. How about the concept and theory of grit or school choice? So I introduced these examples of manufactured language to strongly encourage the audience to truly think about how we use language in the classroom and in our syllabi and in our assignments, our book adoptions, our lectures, our assessment of students' work, and particularly our feedback to students' written work. So in keeping with the study of language through a framework of anti-racism, it's important to remember that racism is not a fixed identity, but only when we adopt language manufactured to support racist policies or practices. That's Kennedy's perspective. Racist ideas ultimately exist in all of us as represented in this list. And I won't go through all of these, but there's a whole source there of a whole bunch of racial microaggressions that some of us might or might not have experienced. You can't be racist because I have a friend who is insert person of color. You speak English so well. And I'm going to turn to the last one in reference to parents separated from their children at the border. Well, they deserved it. So what phrases from the previous list have you found yourself saying unknowingly, or what sayings have you experienced from that list of microaggressions? I'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, moving on. So this concept of microaggressions and maybe the experience of having these racialized moments, clearly they may have happened to everyone who's in attendance today at different points in their life, but sometimes we often romanticize this world of higher education that clearly it can't happen in the ivory tower, right? Well, I think it's really important to kind of share with you my own experiences with things that were from this list. So the English person in me loves to be, I'm a storyteller, so I'm going to present a story to you about my own experience with these microaggressions. So in 2016, our former dean presented an opportunity for me to attend the Council of Independent Colleges chair workshop in Spokane, Washington as a new chair. The session was advertised to focus on strategies and practical approaches to develop leadership skills that promote academic quality and enhance resilience for chairs and the faculty they work with. On the day of the check-in, I found myself exhausted and I needed to eat. I'm Latina, I gotta eat. The first welcome session was almost an hour away, and it was advertised in the conference program that there would be snacks available to participants. So I decided it would be a good time to stake my spot before others and go grab myself some snacks in the lobby. As I stood over several tables with snacks and drinks, I noticed a few white female attendees at the far end of the table staring at me. I began to put some fruit and food and drinks and all this free stuff into my bag, and I began to walk towards the females at the end of the table who were now clearly talking about me. Within moments, one female approached me. Excuse me, young lady, that food is not for you. I politely questioned what they meant, and then the other colleague she was speaking to firmly said, "This is for our group of university chairs and not for hotel guests." I quickly tried to correct them that I was indeed a conference attendee when the first female interrupted me and said, "I need to see your badge just to make sure." Yeah, that really happened. If this was not a demoralizing moment, during a lunch break at the event, the members of CIC attempted to get people to socialize. And so signs were posted for different departments to sit at different tables. I saw English and communication. I'm like, oh, there's my peeps. I'm going to go sit with them. So I decided to join the group of mostly male and all white chairs. When we all decided to go around the table and introduce ourselves, nobody received follow-up questions, but friendly nods and smiles. When I finished, I was asked where I earned my degree, when I earned my degree, how long I was teaching. When I joyfully said that I was currently teaching a summer class in Mexican American literature, not one, but two people on the table were shocked and asked for clarification. Really? That's not considered an English literature. Another expressed interest if my department actually accepted this course as quote unquote real literature. This experience can best be captured with this Toni Morrison quote, that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. I have to remind myself that my existence as a department chair at this conference was clearly the minority, or 2% all year long, as this graph visually illustrates, which CIC shared with me, by the way. My experience at this conference provided a small glimpse into the experience of other scholars or faculty of color who are frequently questioned for their scholarship, their teaching, and the very presence of members of the academy. My experience is not new and occurs at an alarming rate, yet we rarely talk about the frequent othering of faculty, staff, and administrators of color. Supporting an anti-racist framework at every institution, including the conference like the one I attended, helps address these microaggressions, or what Kendi calls racial assaults, and establishes a welcoming and empowering space that supports and encourages diverse voices. At no time during this conference were discussions on racial disparities encouraged or even introduced, which was a lost opportunity for more than 200 attendees whose responsibilities as department chairs include hiring, training, assessment, and creating equitable workspaces. So for the audience members out there and those who have experienced these same things to me, anti-racist scholars, artists, and activists are exhausted. And we have to be able to ask ourselves as an institution, what are we doing to address racist policies, practices that historically marginalize voices? Well, I want to then again thank Val and the Center for Teaching Excellence and everyone that supported to create this speaking series, because this is a small step in moving forward. So, getting closer to the next part of our conversation, moving towards anti-racism ultimately begins with you, who's in attendance today. I want to introduce Dr. Andrew M. Imbram, who created this really sensational chart on becoming an anti-racist, where he kind of moves through these spheres of, starting off with studying yourself, begins with, are you in this fear zone where you avoid hard conversations, where it's very difficult for you to strive to be comfortable? And then there's this ultimate shift to the learning zone, where you begin to see that racism is a problem happening out there. And I kind of think this is where some, not all, but some parts of the US started with the murder of George Floyd, right? That we're starting to talk about it, understand things of structural racism, but he sort of puts this nice shift to the growth zone, where how do you become and promote and become an advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist, where you begin to educate your peers, you sit with the discomfort, right? So in thinking about this chart, with one of the things I want to point out is anti-racist theories have always existed. I mean, pretty much blatantly, for decades, when you look at what was an outdated phrase called multiculturalism, right? And so this is kind of like a hodgepodge of different kind of theoretical frameworks that they all sort of say moving towards an anti-racist framework leads to certain steps. And that first step ultimately is for you to take inventory of your use of language. I mean, all the studies, all the literature I'll share with you today, that typically is step one. You have to be vulnerable and you have to begin to take inventory of your use of language. You need to ask yourself, how are you contributing to racist rhetoric, policies, or ideologies? The second step then is to begin to check our privileges, which ultimately all of us are privileged here today. The very fact that you have technology to listen to this presentation shows that we're all privileged here today. The third step is to understand that this is a process that moves from studying our own fears, our own biases. So it really is a time for us to listen and learn from those who are trying to speak about things that are ultimately crucial, especially when it comes to what our students are experiencing. The fourth step to becoming anti-racist is ultimately to do the work. This is not easy work. It's difficult work. Clearly, it's exhausting work. It's uncomfortable work. And quite frankly, for everyone here who's a scholar of color, they could tell you this is very painful work sometimes. And last, how much effort have you done to really know your students? Do we know our students' language, their culture, their aspirations, their understanding of how they define racist or racism, their idea of community, their social powers in this world? All of these are ultimately sort of these steps that will hopefully mobilize you as an audience to the growth zone. So here's a wellness check right before we move on. Are you still invested in reevaluating your teaching practices? I'm hoping everyone's going to type in yes or you're still actively listening. So if you are still invested in reevaluating your teaching practices, this next section will hopefully help you move forward. So now we move towards anti-racist pedagogy and ultimately what it looks like. So anti-racist pedagogy ultimately problematizes terms and phrases like experts, traditional, historical, scholars, what defines a canon, who has the sense of authority, what is Western literature, Western historical thought, patriot, American dream, or even things like American exceptionalism. Now, ultimately, there's much more to this list. I just put some of the list that people who practice this particular pedagogical framework, these are things we problematize always in the classroom. Anti-racist pedagogy is, we pretty much established, it's about self-exploration in and out of the classroom. What it is not, it's not about including voices of color in your reading list. It's not about saying, oh, I'm going to put some brown and black voices pop on my reading list. It's not about that. It is about how you teach in all of your courses and really begins with self-awareness on your social position, but not only in the classroom, in the discipline, in your research, in the department, in university, and also in community work. So anti-racist pedagogy does pretty much all of this listed here today. It provides spaces where students can heal, and spaces is an ambiguous term that could be digital, virtual, physical, etc. It provides spaces where students and faculty can study their social position. Importantly, it decenters authority of all kinds. It asks that individuals begin with a discussion of what it means to be vulnerable. It provides opportunities to study a wealth of theories, histories, voices that have been subjected to erasure in educational spaces, studies theories, structures, and the practice of racism or power relations embedded in history and academic disciplines. It empowers students by validating their home literacies and their own epistemologies. It invites students to study their own histories and their relationship within power structures. It fosters anti-racist language. It builds community and teaches and models listening skills. So I think this is your last reflection. What from this list would you like to improve on for the spring semester if you're an educator or even if you're an administrator in your own work? I'll give you 30 more seconds. Okay, that was 40 seconds. So I know a popular part of why some people might have shown up here today, and this is what we'll do probably much more in a much more intimate setting next Monday, is, well, how do you frame your class using this particular framework? So I have kind of put together a hodgepodge way of what I do in a semester. And the first thing is crafting an intentional syllabus statement. But not only that, share your pedagogical framework with class. Rarely do faculty do that. We get so into this mist of teaching, right? We don't take a step back and let students know, where are you grounded in? Where is this information grounded in, right? And that's your pedagogical framework. So that becomes the what and whys. What is, like, this class will reevaluate and disrupt, blah, 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 blah. And why is that important, right? Those were two things that I would really encourage faculty to consider crafting when, preparing for the spring. Number two is to invite students to develop ground rules for conversations, especially if this is maybe an undergraduate class, even in a graduate class or online. Develop a vocabulary list. And one important thing, anticipate resistance or strong emotions. Don't avoid conflict at all in the classroom. Instead, review conflict resolution strategies. Reframe conflict when possible to discussions of fear. Just shift that dialogue to a conversation about fear and then openly discuss it. And ways to do that is a timeout moment where sometimes students just kind of need to take a timeout from class or the discussion. Encourage that, right? Or even if it happens virtually, journals, constant wellness checks. Remind students of their complex identity as it relates to race, class, age, gender, sexuality, and disability. Ultimately, one of the benefits of intersectionality when I teach that is that, we're such complex creatures, right? We're not just this fixated identity. And I think it's important to have those conversations in the classroom. Please discuss assumptions foremost week 1, week 2, or with every reading that you use. Encourage activities to build community. But sometimes is where we sometimes struggle with as faculty. We need to teach dialogue, how to have meaningful dialogue. Connect to our core values, our faith, our CDP mission. Encourage curiosity of spaces beyond the literature. That's a shout out for my grad students. Remind students that you are not the center of power, that you do not have the answers. And last, share your experiences, be vulnerable. I think any grad student or any student that's had me as a class, I think that is one of my most positive traits is I am vulnerable in the classroom. I talk about what it means to be first gen. I talk about what it means for my understanding of mothering, right? Of being a home care to my children, struggling with administration and scholarship. I mean, be vulnerable. So why this pedagogy, right? I think James Baldwin really sets this next part up very well for us, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. Anti-racist theories and pedagogy force us to face what ultimately makes this pedagogy so valuable. So I'm going to provide some examples to sort of validate why this pedagogy is so significant in educational spaces. And these are all real examples. In our first example, in San Antonio, middle school students at Great Hearts Monte Vista were asked to study the positive and negative aspects of slavery for assignment, as you can see here in the background. The teacher was eventually placed on leave. The school did nothing to address anti-racist faculty development, and the teacher was promoted to dean. And the next example, example 2, a social studies teacher in Tom Rivers in New Jersey presented a history lesson where students reenacted what it was like to be a slave, with some asked to lay on a dirty floor. The teacher also made cracking whip noises while students pretended to pick cotton. Example 3, in North Carolina, a math lesson on the 3/5 Compromise of 1787 asked students to compare the value of slaves with white people, asking how many slaves would be needed to equal at least 4 white people. And that's the test there you can see in the background. Example 4, DeAndre Arnold, a senior in Barber Hill Independent School District in Montebello View, was asked to cut his dreadlocks or be prevented from graduating high school. He's not alone in schools targeting students of color who faced hair discrimination with racist dress code policies. Example 5, a history textbook was in danger of being introduced to Texas students and depicted racial stereotypes and inaccurate history about Mexican Americans and Chicanx groups. It was published by Momentum Industries, which is owned by a former Texas State Board of Education member, Cynthia Dunbar, a right-wing conservative Christian lawyer and author of One Nation Under God, How the Left is Trying to Erase What Made Us Great. There were no experts in Mexican American history included in the creation of this text. And after great protests by scholars and activists, some of them who are joining us here today, who challenged the Texas State Board of Education, the board was eventually pressured to reject the book unanimously. And that's one of the most controversial quotes too that was often used about Mexican laborers. So places to start, this is how we get towards ending this workshop today. These are only my suggested resources for those who really kind of want to do this work, right? This uncomfortable work, but this very important work. Anti-racist pedagogies ultimately can be found or expressed, and this is not a complete list by any means, but these are the areas of my research, my discipline, my scholarship and publication. So critical race theory, Chicana Latina feminist theory, Black feminist theory, queer theory, and Latinx critical race theory. I want to make a note that these particular theoretical frameworks and others that aren't here, indigenous studies, are responses to education which has historically been exclusionary and function ultimately to assimilate students by normalizing dominant knowledge. Articles that I'd recommend, if you're interested, I can email you these today. These are 3 fundamental ones that I would think are the easiest to break down anti-racist theories: Wagner, Blakely, and Kishimoto's work. Although 2005, 2018, the work itself still speaks for itself, and I'm happy to share those for you. The 3 websites on the bottom provide an overwhelming amount of blogs and news sources and documentaries that are recommended and movies that are documented, and even conversation starters. And I would definitely encourage you to go through those. Speaking about some books, and some of these books are required in my 7333 Pedagogy and Theory course. First is Bettina Love, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching the Pursuit of Education Reform. She asked this really great question: do we really love all our children? And in this book, she sees education as this, quote, collective dignity and human power for justice. She really pushes us that we must work in partnership with students' own knowledge in their own communities. And then she really goes into depth with what abolitionist teaching is, which is anti-racist in itself, and that it's rooted in this internal desire that we all have for freedom, joy, restorative justice, and to matter to ourselves, our communities, and family. And you'll see that constant theme with all these sources of mattering to ourselves and ultimately having spaces where we could celebrate ourselves. Chela Sandoval's work is sometimes not looked at as a pedagogical framework, but I think it is, because she introduces a rhetoric of resistance and really sort of explores this rhetoric of resistance in the feminist movement and introduces a methodology of love, which ultimately I see also as a pedagogy of love. Dolores Delgado Bernal and other contributing authors. This is a fundamental book, I think, for every education major or anyone that's interested in teaching and wants to really explore pedagogy. Chicana Latina Education in Everyday Life provides Chicana Latina feminist perspectives with education, but they do it in an interesting way. So they center predominantly on the family, language, community, cultural wealth, and identity. Anything Bell Hooks I would recommend, but out of all the Bell Hooks books, I would always start with Teaching to Transgress. It's her own personal narrative about teaching, where she explores class, gender, and race in the classroom. A newer book, Bordered Writers, Latinx Identities and Literacy Practices at HSIs, is Isabel Baca and other contributing authors. They ultimately examine innovative writing pedagogies and the experience of Latinx faculty and students. This really celebrates what it means to teach at a Hispanic serving institution. I definitely think is a must read for your bookshelf as well. Iris de Vries, Reclaiming Composition for Chicano, Chicanas, and Other Ethnic Minorities, studies the history of ethnic minorities in the field of writing studies. Her introduction actually made me weep. That's how powerful the book is. Laura Rendon, Sente Pensante Pedagogy, introduces a holistic and pedagogical model grounded in social justice and liberation. She actually provides an entire class framework at the end of the book. Again, another must-have. The Anti-Racist Discussion Pedagogy is actually, you can find this online, and it's an open, free workbook for faculty that really want to move towards anti-racism in their practices in and out of the classroom. It's sensational, and everything in there is free and open, and I would encourage those who want to sort of jump into it to start here too. Of course, Gloria Anzaldúa. Now, most people celebrate Borderlands as sort of the go-to for Anzaldúa's work. I really think the jewel of her work is in Light in the Dark, because she provides this framework for healing and spiritual activism, and really kind of provides this alternative way to see student agencies and bodies. It's beautifully done, and that's a required reading in my graduate class. But for those of you who are interested, I'm also going to clearly recommend Teaching Gloria y Anzaldúa, Pedagogy and Practice for Our Classrooms and Communities. So contributing editors are my homegirl, Margaret Cantu Sanchez and Norma Cantu. This recently came out in October. We are trying to promote this book as much as possible, because although Anzaldúa is celebrated as an author and a poet and a theorist and a historian and all these beautiful things, how do we teach her work? So in this book, you'll find a bunch of authors that will actually show you how they translate her theories into practice in the classroom. So last, here's my call to action for those in attendance. First, spend time and really use this break to reflect on your action or inaction with racial inequalities or injustices. I'd ask that you revisit your syllabi and really think about reimagining your class with this gaze of anti-racism. Create assignments and activities that are rooted in anti-racist framework. And if you're free, join us on Monday, where we can engage in reflection together and craft assignments, discuss shared resources, maybe how to set up your syllabi or that first day of classwork. That one I see more where I'm a moderator, there to answer questions, provide feedback. It won't be like this at all. It'll be lots of us talking is what I imagine. I want to really end with two quotes before I get to the last screen to take questions, which again is Kendi's quote, but there is no neutrality in the racism of struggle. One either allows racial inequalities to preserve as a racist or confronts racial inequalities as an anti-racist. There is not an in-between space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I'll leave you with St. Francis de Sales' quote that I live by: be who you are and be that well. I could take questions now, Val.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Zepeda. That was wonderful. That was wonderful. We do have time for questions, everybody. And I realized that I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but hello, my name is Valerie Martinez, and I'm an assistant professor of history here at Our Lady of the Lake University. And again, this is the second installment of our larger critical pedagogy workshop series. So stay tuned for more in the spring, and we have a flyer that we can distribute as well. Now, we have, do we have any questions from the audience here? Because if not, I have a ton, but I'd love to open it up for other folks. If you just type it in, I can read them off. But I'll actually lead one if I can, if I may, Dr. Cepeda. So you relayed a very personal experience with the at the conference, for example, and that was, it brought on a lot of self-reflection, and it brought on a lot of comments that had been made throughout, my experiences as an educator, but also as a grad student, as somebody who was on the job market and was told, oh, you're not going to have any problem finding a job. I'm like, why? Because my work is that awesome, right? But those microaggressions are painful. So I was really wondering in that moment, how did you confront those? How did you answer those questions? And how, if any, how do you meet resistance? What do you do? What do you say? Part of your action plan was what are you going to do for number 5, or request number 5? And mine is, I wanted to study theories, because in my head, I have to be able to quote someone else. I have to be able to affirm this knowledge by quoting someone else, because when I say it, I just don't have the power behind it, right? So I think, right? So what people's responses in their faces as they look at me say to me. So how do you meet with this resistance? What are your tools? What are your tools that you use, and how do you respond to students, other colleagues, just anybody?
Yeah, well, Val, it's taken me time to get to that point. I will have been teaching in higher ed for close to 2 decades, and only higher ed. And, I think early on in the journey of scholarly work and teaching, you don't know how to confront those. And obviously, the easiest way that you confront those is it's painful. It's painful to feel othered. And so many of my colleagues, who know what it means to feel othered, knows that your first reaction is either to cry or to lash out, right? I think I've gotten to a point that in that particular instance, I approach these, and I'm learning to shift my discourse. For a long time, I, like you, adopted microaggressions. But if you read Kendi's work, he actually made me rethink the term micro, that there's nothing micro about the pain of an assault like that. So he calls them racial assaults. And I thought, wow, I've never considered that, right? He didn't want to belittle what it meant to have that feeling and that pain. In that particular instance, there happened to be someone else who was getting food at the table. And I approached the lady. By the way, my tag was left in the room. So when she asked, I need to see your tag, I said, I'll be happy to give it to you if you go tell everyone else at this table and near this table that you want to see their tags too. And she kind of backed off from there and walked away. In the instance where I was asked if the Mexican American literature was real, it gave me an opportunity to challenge some of the colleagues at that table, what they define as real. So normally I just kind of throw that conversation back. I don't feel like I have to defend myself. Instead, I'll shift the power dynamic to the person. And again, this is a rhetorical strategy. If you understand the rhetorical triangle of who my audience is, they're never going to buy into my perspective if they're at that level of making assumptions. So instead, I have to shift the power dynamic and say, well, in that instance, I asked them, oh, that's interesting. So can you explain to me what you define as real literature? And he tried to explain. I said, well, who told you that? Who taught you that? And it got to the point where he was really uncomfortable and was like, I need to go get iced tea. So it kind of stopped the conversation. So, for me, approaching colleagues is very different than I would approach students. For students who maybe approach these uncomfortable situations of not knowing how to, respond in a classroom or feeling like they don't have a voice in the classroom, I always make sure that I find a way to meet students where they're at. So I touch on things like vulnerability. I touch on things like fears, like what's leading you to feel uncomfortable to read this author who may have Spanish in it. When some of my students read Ansel Dua at first, they're like, why do I have to read some parts of Spanish? I'm like, you don't have to read parts of Spanish, but what is causing you to fearfully reject the Spanish? And so it's moving away and forcing people to reflect within is a strategy that I think has been quite successful in my time of teaching. I hope that answers some of your questions. That's all we're waiting for.
Yes, thank you. Are we unmuted here?
Hello, everybody. Yes, I have went ahead and muted all of the attendees. So, mute. You have things going on in your right. Busy. This will allow you to actually use your voice to ask a question.
I see a question here. So it says this person is asking about the pedagogical terminology mentioned earlier, Bloom's taxonomy. What are the racist assumptions here, and how do we address it?
Well, that's a great question, but it's so long for me in such a short amount of space to share. Actually, whoever asked that question, if they email me, I'm happy to share with them a whole chapter of my work that addresses Bloom's taxonomy. And I'm talking about the original taxonomy. I know that it's been redeveloped and recreated, but I propose, again, Bloom's messaging ultimately was grounded in this assumption that students come into our classrooms with knowledge. And so an anti-racist theoretical framework debunks that myth and saying that students come in with cultural wealth that we should be tapping into. And so I'm happy to share my perspective on why I pick on Bloom's taxonomy particularly. I'm hearing so many background noises. I'm sorry.
Yeah, never mind. Well, I think maybe we'll just mute again. There we go. Okay, so I have another question here on how we can apply these to the apps courses. How we can apply these practices in apps.
Well, I think this particular framework and model really just means us being intentional with the design. And part of that speaks towards way before the semester's already started. And so like anytime I prep a class, I often prep a semester ahead of time. And it really means crafting syllabus statements that just makes it clear this is the framework we're moving towards. And maybe instead looks at students understanding power relations. And I think we need to start having those conversations of what power dynamics are a bit more, and specifically having students engage in that dialogue. It'll make them much more aware of the power dynamics that ultimately affect them in the long run in local politics, in the classroom, etc. But that's a necessary conversation to have.
Okay, there we go. We muted everybody again. We were going to kick everybody. Yeah, we were going to give everybody a chance to just voice it, but it seems better just to, mute. Okay, it's all done. Okay, great. Thank you. Do we have additional questions here? I know we're running out of time. Well, since we're actually on point right here.
Awesome.
Okay, well, great. We thank you all for your participation, and we look forward to having more people converse and dialogue here in the actual syllabus redesign workshop coming on Monday, November 16th. From 12:30 to 1:30. So please come prepared with your syllabi, your questions, whatever you have. I know I have some questions on text specifically, and the questions that I'm particularly asking, because we know that it's not just as Professor Deborah Vasquez lined us last week. It's all about if we're decolonizing work, it's not just diversification. We're not just throwing in people of color into our assignments or authors. It's how we're applying this. So thank you so much, Dr. Zepeda. We've learned so much, and we look forward to the syllabus redesign workshop here on Monday.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Oops. I actually do have one more if you have a little bit of time. It didn't have any references for anti-racist pedagogy in STEM fields. We can apply many of the suggestions you have shared, but I haven't seen anything specific for the fields that don't traditionally support reflection assignments.
Oh, that would be fantastic. Actually, there is one book. I don't have the name of the book in mind. If they email me, and Norma Canthu was a contributing editor, and it looked at Latinx as a framework for the STEM fields like 2-3 years ago. I'll find the book, and I know one that exists, but I really also encourage faculty to not be so discipline related. Anti-racist theories isn't on a discipline. It looks at a larger a vision of having a better world ultimately. And so that's why the framework could be applied to any discipline. It's not discipline based. It looks at policy, power, and language in a variety of ways. But there is one book I'd recommend. So whoever asked that question, if you email me, by the time you email me, I'll actually send you a copy of what the book is.
That's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really interested in those. I found a couple for biology, social work, but I mean, other outside of the list of those would be great to have. Thank you so much. And we're also wanting a resource list together. So once we have these all together, they'll be up on the faculty SharePoint. And for those who are not a part of Our Lady of Lake University, we still welcome your questions, and we're happy to share our resources with you.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.